Today, any of you can go to a hotel booking website and rent a room in Fall River, Massachusetts. Address: 2nd Street, House 92. A night will cost you about $300. For that money, you'll get an antique bed, creaky floors, and breakfast. You'll be served cornmeal pancakes, molasses, coffee, and bananas. You'll eat while looking at photographs of two elderly people with shattered skulls. This is the most cynical attraction in America, the Lizzie Borden house. The place where greed tore the family apart in the literal sense of the word. We are used to thinking that the story of Lizzie Borden is a story about madness, about a woman who went mad and took an axe in her hands. But that's a lie. If you look at the police reports, wills, and bank statements, you'll see a completely different picture. This is not a thriller. This is an accounting report written in blood. This is a story about $17 million in today's money. This is a story about how skimping on plumbing led to a double murder. Let's go back to that day. Thursday, August 4th, 1892. New England is sweltering in anomalous heat. The temperature in the shade exceeds 30 degrees Celsius. Inside house number 92, it's stifling like in a coffin. The windows are tightly closed. The homeowner, Andrew Borden, forbids opening them. He believes street dust will ruin the carpets. Andrew Borden is a man whose fortune at that time was estimated at $500,000. Today, that's the solid capital of an investment banker, about $17 million. He owns commercial real estate, shares in 3 manufactories. He is the president of a bank. He is the king of Fall River. But look at his house. It's not a palace. It's a narrow wooden box squeezed between other buildings. There is no electricity here, although it's already available to rich people. There is no gas lighting, only kerosene lamps. There is no bathroom. To wash, you have to go down to the basement and heat water in a tub. On the 2nd floor, where his adult daughters live, there are no hallways. To get from her bedroom to the stairs, 32-year-old Lizzie must pass through her older sister's bedroom, and then through her parents' bedroom. No privacy, no space. Andrew Borden built an ideal, maximum security prison for his family, and saved every cent on it. That morning, the family has breakfast with leftovers. Andrew's thrift reached absurdity. He forbade throwing away food. On the table is lamb soup cooked 3 days ago. In the 30-degree heat, without a refrigerator, this soup turned into a biological weapon. The whole family has been suffering from severe food poisoning for several days. They are nauseous. They have fevers. But they eat because their father won't tolerate losses. The contents of the stomachs will become the coroner's main evidence. The medical examiner, Dr. Dolan, will perform the autopsy right on the dining table in the dining room, just a few hours after the murder. He will describe it with chilling precision. The stepmother's stomach, Abby Borden's, had already digested breakfast. The father's stomach, Andrew Borden's, was still full. This gave the investigation the precise math of death. Abby was killed at 9:30 a.m., Andrew at 11. 1.5 hours difference. 1.5 hours of silence in the house, where the killer waited for the second victim's return. This was not a crime of passion. Passion lasts minutes. Here, someone coldly killed a heavy-set elderly woman weighing 90 kilograms while she was making the bed in the guest room, and then waited 1.5 hours for the father to return from the bank to lie down on the sofa in the living room. Someone who knew the house's schedule. Someone who wasn't afraid to stain their dress. When the police arrived at the scene, they saw Andrew Borden. His face was unrecognizable. 11 blows with a sharp object. One of the blows sliced the eyeball in half. The blood was still fresh, dripping onto the carpet that Andrew so cherished from dust. His wallet was in place. His gold watch was in his pocket. This was not a robbery. A burglar would have taken the money and fled. The killer wanted more than cash in the wallet. The killer wanted everything. The paradox of this story is that if Andrew Borden had spent at least $1,000 on a modern house in the prestigious The Hill district, where people of his circle lived, the tragedy might not have happened. Big houses have personal space. In big houses, hatred dissipates through the hallways. But in the cramped house on 2nd Street, hatred concentrated for years, like gas in a closed room. All it took was one spark. The irony of fate. Lizzie Borden will become the main suspect. She will go through a trial that will be called the trial of the century. She will be acquitted. She will inherit her father's millions. She will buy that very large house on the hill she dreamed of. She will have servants, a car, and will travel. But she will die alone, despised by the entire town. The money for which this atrocity was committed won't buy her the main thing: respect. But for now, we are at the beginning of the journey. The bodies are still warm. Police Marshal Hilliard is just entering the house. The maid, Bridget Sullivan, whom they called simply Maggie in the house because it was more convenient for the owners, is sitting on the steps in a state of shock. And Lizzie Borden is standing in her room upstairs. She is wearing an impeccably clean dress, not a drop of blood. Or so it only seems to us. To understand how the daughter of a respected banker could turn into the main enigma of criminology, we must rewind the tape back. We must understand where this money came from, how Andrew Borden's character was formed, and why, in this house, the price of life was lower than the price of spoiled lamb. We are going back to the past, to the origins of the Borden Empire. To understand why a 32-year-old woman could pick up an axe, we must first look into the eyes of the man who raised her. Andrew Jackson Borden. Look closely at his portraits. Tall, skinny as a pole, an old man with a hard gaze and tightly compressed lips. He never smiled. It seemed his face was carved from the granite from which they built foundations in New England. He was the embodiment of the archetype that in America is called a self-made man, a man who made himself. But in Andrew Borden's case, this phrase has a sinister connotation. He made himself from others' misfortunes and total thrift. Andrew was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. The Borden family was old and respected. They came to America back in the 17th century. But Andrew's branch was not wealthy. He started his path at the very bottom of the social ladder, but in a very profitable niche. Andrew Borden started as an undertaker. In the mid-19th century, when epidemics and factory accidents mowed down people by the hundreds, death was the most stable business in Fall River. It was in the Borden and Olney funeral home that his capital and his grim reputation were born. Persistent rumors circulated around the city that made the blood run cold. They said that Andrew Borden, striving to save on wood, ordered coffins slightly shorter than standard size because they were cheaper. And if the deceased turned out to be too tall, Andrew, according to rumors, simply sawed off his feet to fit the body in the box. No one ever proved this in court, but this legend haunted him all his life. It perfectly describes his philosophy. If violating a taboo is necessary for profit, Andrew Borden will get a saw. For him, people were a set of bones and wallets. Dead or alive, it didn't matter, as long as the balance sheet balanced. Having earned his first serious money on funerals, Andrew invested it with surgical precision. He didn't build factories. He started buying walls. He invested in commercial real estate. The center of Fall River, which was booming as the textile capital of the world, gradually came under his ownership. He rented out spaces for shops, offices, and warehouses. He became a landlord, a man to whom the city paid rent. By 1890, he owned 3 major manufactories, was president of the Union Savings Bank, and a director of 2 other financial institutions. It would seem the American dream had come true. He had millions in today's money. But here begins the pathology. Usually, people earn money to change the quality of their lives. Andrew Borden earned money for the sake of money itself. For him, the numbers in the bank book were not a medium of exchange, but points in a game he played with himself. He was fabulously wealthy, but continued to behave like a pauper. Every morning, as president of the bank, he would leave his house with a basket of eggs. He had a farm in Swansea, and the hens laid eggs. Andrew couldn't let them go to waste. He walked the streets and sold these eggs to his own tenants and neighbors. Imagine, a man whose signature determines the fates of businesses, haggling over a couple of cents for a dozen eggs. In everyday life, he was a tyrant of asceticism. When his first wife, Sarah, died, leaving him with 2 small daughters, Emma and Lizzie, Andrew faced a choice. He needed a housekeeper. Hiring a nanny and governess was expensive. Marriage was cheaper. 2 years later, he brought Abby Durfee Gray into the house. She was 37 years old, a spinster by the standards of the time, plump and unremarkable. This was a deal, not a marriage. Abby got a roof over her head and the status of a rich man's wife. Andrew got a free housemaid and overseer for the children. No love, no passion. Just another line in the expense optimization column. Emma and Lizzie never called Abby mother. To them, she was Mrs. Borden, or simply her. They sensed the falseness of this union from childhood. The girls grew up in an atmosphere where every spent coin was perceived as a personal insult to their father. While other rich heiresses of Fall River went to balls in Newport, wore silks from Paris, and learned to dance, the Borden daughters lived in siege fortress mode. Their father instilled in them a terrible idea. The world wants to take our money. Everyone around is an enemy. Servants steal sugar. Merchants overcharge. Relatives want the inheritance. Andrew Borden built his empire on fear and greed. He believed that such a state of affairs was eternal, that his daughters would obey forever, that his wife would endure his stinginess forever, and that the city would pay him rent forever. But he overlooked one thing. His daughters grew up. They saw how others lived. They saw luxurious mansions on the hill, where electric light burned in the windows and music poured from the open doors. They knew that their father was richer than many of those who lived on the hill. And this dissonance between the reality of their bank account and the squalor of their daily life bred black envy in Lizzie Borden's soul. By 30 years old, Lizzie had turned into a time bomb. She was a wealthy heiress who couldn't dispose of even $1 without her father's permission. She was a lady who lived worse than a maid in a good house. Andrew Borden, unwittingly, created ideal conditions for a crime. He taught his daughters that money was the only value in the world. And one day, Lizzie decided to apply this lesson in practice. She simply recalculated the cost of her father's life and decided that his death would bring more dividends. But before the axe falls, we must see what this Gilded Age looked like for those fortunate enough to be born into families where money was spent, not hidden under the mattress. We must understand the context of the era to appreciate the degree of humiliation in which the Borden sisters lived. It was a time when America was going mad with money. The Civil War had ended. The country was covered with a network of railroads. Factories smoked 24 hours a day, and never in human history had such colossal fortunes been created so quickly and so dirtily. While Andrew Borden was counting pennies for the sold eggs in the kitchen in Fall River, just 30 kilometers to the south, in the city of Newport, a completely different life was unfolding. This was the life that Lizzie Borden read about in the society columns, clenching her fists in helpless rage. Newport was the summer playground for those who had won the capitalist lottery. There, on the rocky ocean shore, the families of Vanderbilts, Astors, and Rockefellers were building what they modestly called cottages. But these were not cottages. These were palaces transported from Europe, stone by stone. In that same 1892, when Lizzie was suffocating from the heat in a house without a bathroom, Cornelius Vanderbilt II was completing the finishing of his summer home, The Breakers. 70 rooms, 4 floors, cladding in gold and platinum, bathtubs carved from solid blocks of marble, where not just water flowed from the faucets, but seawater heated to the perfect temperature. One dining hall in this house was larger than the entire Borden house. For one ball, the Vanderbilts spent $200,000 of that time. In today's money, that's $6 million for one evening. $6 million on champagne, oysters, orchids, and dresses from Charles Worth. Andrew Borden had capital comparable to some of these people. He was not just well off, he was the elite of Massachusetts' financial world. But he refused to participate in this arms race of luxury. And that was the main tragedy of his daughters. Lizzie and Emma belonged to the first generation of heiresses. This was a new psychological type born in the Gilded Age. Fathers, tough, calloused predators who gnawed out their fortunes with labor and blood. Children, soft, educated, craving recognition and pleasures, but unable to earn them. Lizzie saw how her contemporaries lived. She saw the dollar princesses, daughters of American magnates who married British dukes, exchanging daddy's money for titles. She saw Consuelo Vanderbilt, whose dowry amounted to millions. And what did Lizzie have? She had her father's fortune hanging over her like the sword of Damocles. She was rich on paper, but poor in reality. Social stratification in Fall River had a clear geography. The city stood on a hill descending to the Taunton River. At the bottom, by the water, textile factories smoked, port docks bustled, and immigrants huddled. At the top of the hill, in the district simply called The Hill, lived the local aristocracy. There were wide avenues, lawns, tennis courts, and houses with turrets in Victorian style. There lived the families with whom Lizzie would like to have tea. But Andrew Borden bought a house at the bottom, in the business district, next to banks and shops, so it was close for him to walk to work. For Lizzie, this was daily humiliation. Living on 2nd Street meant living above the shop. Ladies from the Hill didn't come to visit her because their carriages would have to go through dirty, noisy neighborhoods. But there was one moment that gave Lizzie a breath of freedom and perhaps became the catalyst for the future catastrophe. In 1890, 2 years before the murder, Andrew did something unprecedented. He allowed Lizzie to go on a grand tour of Europe. This was the obligatory trip for young ladies of that time. Lizzie spent several months abroad. She saw Paris, Rome, London. She went to the opera. She saw how people live who don't skimp on candles. She realized that life could be bright, tasty, and beautiful. Imagine her return. After the Parisian boulevards and London hotels, she returns to grey, stifling Fall River, to a house where her father forbids lighting an extra lamp, and her stepmother reworks old sheets. The contrast was unbearable. Lizzie had tried a drug called freedom and luxury, and now the withdrawal was agonizing. She tried to create status for herself in other ways. If her father wouldn't give money for balls, she would go into charity. She became a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, secretary of the Fruit and Flower Mission, taught in Sunday school for immigrant children. Lizzie desperately tried to be a good lady. She wanted society to respect her for her deeds, since she couldn't impress them with outfits. But here too, her father's money played a cruel joke. Everyone knew she was the daughter of a millionaire who wore an old coat. They whispered behind her back. They looked at her not as an equal, but as the daughter of a stingy eccentric. In the Gilded Age, they judged by clothes and saw off by the bank check. Lizzie could present neither. Tension was building. A Cold War began in the Borden house. Lizzie and Emma stopped dining with their parents. They staged a boycott. If Andrew and Abby entered a room, the daughters left. It was a war of positions in a confined space. Lizzie began spending money on trifles that drove her father mad. She went to the dressmaker. The dress that would figure in the murder case was made of bengaline silk, an expensive fabric that rustled when walking. Lizzie wanted to at least sound like a wealthy woman. The scariest thing for Lizzie was time. She was 32 years old. At the end of the 19th century, that was a sentence. She was officially considered an old maid. Chances of marriage were fading with each day. Without a husband, she remained a perpetual child under her father's guardianship. Andrew completely controlled her financial fate. He could leave all the money to her stepmother. He could live another 20 years. Lizzie realized with horror that her youth was slipping away, burning in the furnace of her father's miserliness. She saw her contemporaries nursing children and managing estates, while she still had to beg for money for new ribbons for her hat. It was in this context, against the backdrop of the shining, mad, extravagant Gilded Age, that the squalor of the house on 2nd Street felt especially acute. This was not just poverty. This was poverty by choice. The father chose such a life for them, and Lizzie began to understand. As long as Andrew Borden was alive, this choice would determine her fate too. The golden calf that her father worshipped demanded sacrifices. But Lizzie no longer wanted to be a victim. She wanted to be the priestess of this cult. But for that, she needed to take the altar into her own hands. In the 19th century in America, there existed an invisible but insurmountable wall, stronger than the Great Chinese one. It was not built of stone. It was built of calling cards, tea invitations, and surnames on guest lists. This wall separated the Hill, the aristocracy district on the Hill, from the rest of Fall River. And Lizzie Borden had been banging her head against this wall her entire conscious life. For us today, social status is measured by the number of Instagram followers or the car brand. In 1892, the social code was more complex and merciless. Fall River was a city with a clear caste system. At the top of the social pyramid were the families of textile factory owners, Braytons, Durfees, Remingtons. They lived in the Highlands district, which locals simply called the Hill. From there, from on high, they looked down on the smoking chimneys of their factories and the workers scurrying below. The air on the Hill was fresh, the streets wide, and the houses true architectural masterpieces of Victorian Gothic and Queen Anne style. The Borden family bore one of the oldest surnames in the region. Their ancestors had come here back in the 17th century. By right of blood, Lizzie should have been at the top of this pyramid. By the size of her father's bank account, she should have been the queen of local society. But geography is destiny. Andrew Borden, in his stubborn desire to be closer to his office, forced the family to live in the lower town on 2nd Street. It was as if a billionaire today lived in an apartment above a shawarma stand next to the train station. The 2nd Street district was businesslike, noisy, and dirty. Nearby were stables that reeked of manure in the heat. Across from the house was a women's clothing store. A little further, an undertaker's shop. For Fall River's upper society, a visit to the Borden house was unthinkable. No self-respecting lady from the Hill would order her coachman to stop her carriage in that district. Lizzie found herself in social isolation. She was too rich for the shopkeeper neighbors, but lived too low for the aristocrats. Lizzie understood the rules of the game. If she couldn't impress society with her house, she had to buy a ticket in another way. In the Victorian era, the only legal social elevator for an unmarried woman was charity and the church. And Lizzie, with fanatical persistence, began building a career as a saint. She joined the Central Congregational Church, the gathering place for the elite. She became a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. She took on the role of secretary in the Fruit and Flower Mission, an organization that delivered bouquets and fruits to hospitals for the poor. This was a brilliant move. Mission meetings took place not in basements, but in the parlors of rich ladies from the Hill. This gave Lizzie a legitimate reason to enter the mansions she dreamed of. She sat at the same table with Mrs. Remington and Mrs. Brayton, discussing the purchase of oranges for tuberculosis patients, and absorbed the details of their lifestyle. She saw their porcelain, their draperies, their manners. She saw the life that her father had stolen from her. But even here she felt like an outsider. She was that strange Miss Borden. She was 32, she was unmarried, and she wore dresses remade 3 times. Behind her back, they called her stingy, although stinginess was not her choice, but her curse. She donated to the church money that she begged from her father with scandals, trying to buy respect. And here enters the main enemy of Lizzie in this social war, her stepmother, Abby Borden. In the eyes of Lizzie and her sister Emma, Abby was of low origin. She was the daughter of a tinsmith. When Andrew married her, the daughters perceived it as a betrayal not only of their mother's memory, but also of their social status. They considered Abby fat, vulgar, and greedy. Although facts say the opposite, Abby was a quiet and submissive woman who simply wanted to live out her life in warmth. But for Lizzie, she became the scapegoat for all failures. The conflict escalated to a hot phase 5 years before the murder, in 1887. This event historians call the Whitehead House Incident. This is the key moment in the financial ledger of our tragedy. The stepmother had a stepsister who lived in poverty. Andrew, in a rare fit of generosity, or possibly trying to buy silence in the house, secretly bought a house for his wife's sister and registered it in Abby's name. The price tag was $1,500, about $50,000 today. When Lizzie and Emma learned about it, hell broke loose in the house. For the sisters, this was not an act of father's mercy. This was the theft of their inheritance. They reasoned like cynical shareholders. Every dollar spent on the stepmother's family is a dollar stolen from us. They staged a boycott against their father, stopped calling Abby mother, and demanded financial compensation. Andrew, wanting to extinguish the conflict, made a fatal mistake. He bought them off. He transferred the grandfather's house and several shares into the daughter's ownership. The value of the gift was equivalent to what Abby had received. But Lizzie and Emma didn't know how to manage real estate. A few weeks later, they demanded that their father buy the house back from them for cash. Andrew paid them $5,000 each. That's $150,000 in today's money. It would seem like a victory. Lizzie got a huge sum in cash. But this incident broke something inside the family forever. Lizzie understood. Her father's resources are finite, and there is a war over them. Deadbolts appeared in the house. Lizzie installed a bolt on her bedroom door. Andrew locked his study. The family split into two warring camps living under one roof. The atmosphere of paranoia peaked in the summer of 1891, exactly a year before the murder. The unthinkable happened. In broad daylight, while Andrew and Abby were home, someone broke into the father's bedroom and stole cash and gold watches from his desk. The locks were not broken. Andrew called the police. The sheriff began an investigation, questioned the servants, examined the windows. But suddenly, Andrew Borden ordered the case stopped. He withdrew the complaint. Why? Because he realized the thief was inside the house. It was Lizzie. Only she knew where the keys were, and only she had the motive. Lizzie needed money to maintain her social status, for trips, for gifts, to appear rich. She was robbing her own father to buy herself a place in society. The father knew. The daughter knew that he knew. They never spoke about it aloud. Andrew simply bought a safe and placed it in the dining room. Now he hid money from his own daughter behind a steel door. This was the end of trust. In her father's eyes, Lizzie turned from a beloved daughter into a threat to his capital. And for Lizzie, her father turned into a jailer sitting on a chest of gold and slowly strangling her. In early 1892, the tension became unbearable. Lizzie was 32. All her friends were married. They had children, houses, servants, and Lizzie sat in a stifling room, counting pennies and listening to the stepmother snoring behind the wall, who, as she believed, was planning to take all the inheritance. Rumors spread in the city that Andrew was going to rewrite his will. Uncle John Morse, the very guest who arrived the day before the murder, came supposedly to discuss transferring the Swansea farm into the management of, who do you think? Abby again. For Lizzie, this sounded like an alarm signal. The farm is an asset. If the farm goes to Abby, what next? The bank? Stocks? The house? Lizzie felt the ground slipping from under her feet. The social war was lost. She would never make it to the Hill while she was Miss Borden from 2nd Street with a pittance allowance. The only way to win this war, the only way to break through to the top and become that Lisbeth of Maplecroft she dreamed of being, was to liquidate those who held the keys to the safe. Lizzie stopped going to lunches with her parents. She stopped talking to her stepmother. She shut herself in her room, looking out the window at the scorching street. And perhaps it was then, watching the carts passing by, that she began to count. Not money, but minutes. Minutes it would take to change her fate with one decisive blow. Or 40 blows. In 1895, just 3 years after the events in Fall River, the loudest deal of this era will take place. Consuelo Vanderbilt will marry the Duke of Marlborough. Her father will pay $2.5 million for this marriage. The Duke will get money to renovate the ancestral castle, and the Vanderbilt family, entry into royal palaces. Consuelo will cry through the entire wedding because she loved another. But who cares about tears when such assets are at stake? Lizzie Borden knew perfectly well about this Vanity Fair. She read the newspapers. She knew that with her father's fortune she could claim, if not a duke, then a solid baronet, or a successful industrialist from Boston. She could buy herself a ticket out of the stifling house on 2nd Street. But in Andrew Borden's business plan, there was no line for dowry. For Andrew Borden, marrying off his daughters was a bad investment. Giving a daughter in marriage meant giving part of the capital to another man. This contradicted the very essence of his nature. He preferred to keep assets to himself. As a result, he turned his daughters into illiquid goods on the marriage market. Lizzie and Emma remained old maids, not because they were ugly or stupid, but because their father was too greedy to release them into the world. He preserved their youth just as he preserved money in the safe. And so, instead of a brilliant engagement and wedding of the century, a completely different deal was being prepared in the Borden house. The deal that became the trigger for the massacre. On August 3rd, 1892, the day before the murder, there was a knock at the house. But it was not a fiancé. It was John Vinicum Morse, the brother of Andrew's late first wife, the blood uncle of Lizzie and Emma. It would seem like family blood, but in the Borden world, family ties meant nothing if they weren't backed by financial interest. John Morse didn't come to visit his nieces. He came to talk business. Morse was the only person Andrew Borden listened to, and on that stifling day, they shut themselves in the sitting room for a conversation that Lizzie probably eavesdropped on. The talk was about the farm in Swansea, that very farm where the family spent summers, where there were chickens and fresh air. Andrew planned to transfer this farm into management, and persistent rumors circulated that the ultimate beneficiary of this deal was again to be Abby Borden. For Lizzie, this became a hammer blow even before the axe came into play. First, the stepmother's sister's house, now the farm. Assets were flowing from the Borden family into the Gray family hands. Lizzie saw a system in this. Her father was methodically, piece by piece, depriving her of her inheritance. The deal of the century for Lizzie turned into a nightmare. She risked becoming a penniless orphan with a living stepmother who would take everything. On that same day, August 3rd, Lizzie commits an act that prosecutors later will call the dress rehearsal for the murder. She goes out into the city. The heat is unbearable. Lizzie enters Eli Bence's pharmacy on South Main Street. She looks the pharmacist in the eye and asks him to sell her 10 cents worth of prussic acid. It's a deadly poison. Lizzie speaks calmly, businesslike. "I need it to kill moths in my fur cape." The pharmacist refuses. By the laws of the state of Massachusetts, prussic acid is dispensed only on a doctor's prescription. Lizzie doesn't argue. She simply turns around and leaves. She is cold as ice. This episode tells us a lot. Lizzie was looking for a clean way to terminate her father's deal. Poison is a woman's weapon. It's quiet. It looks like a heart attack or that very food poisoning from which the whole family was already suffering. If the pharmacist had sold her the acid, the story of Lizzie Borden would have remained in medical records as the tragic death of the spouses from spoiled lamb. But the pharmacist said no, and Lizzie had to improvise. She had to switch tactics from quiet liquidation to brute force. That same evening, Lizzie goes to visit her friend Alice Russell. It's a strange visit. Lizzie is gloomy. She speaks in riddles. She tells Alice, "I feel that trouble is hanging over this house. I'm afraid that someone will do something terrible. My father has so many enemies." This was a genius move of a manipulator. Lizzie was creating an alibi in advance. She was planting in the witness's head the idea of an external enemy, of mysterious people who wish evil on Andrew Borden. She was preparing public opinion for the fact that tragedy is inevitable. She was playing the role of a frightened daughter, although in reality she was the director who had already set the scenery for the final act. Returning home, Lizzie went up to her room. Uncle John Morse was sleeping in the guest bedroom, the very one where Abby's body would be found the next morning. The family went to bed. Andrew and Abby probably discussed the future transfer of the farm, pleased with how cleverly they were managing the property. Lizzie lay in the darkness, listening to footsteps behind the wall. A deal with her father was impossible. A deal with her conscience had already been made. In the world of big money, there is a concept of hostile takeover. This is when one company takes over another against the will of its management. Lizzie Borden was planning the most brutal hostile takeover in Fall River's history. She intended to liquidate the board of directors to become the sole owner of the controlling stake. In the morning of August 4th, Uncle John Morse left the house early, around 9 a.m., to visit relatives in another part of the city. He unwittingly cleared the stage. Andrew went to the bank. Only women remained in the house: Abby, the maid Maggie, and Lizzie. The deal of the century for Lizzie was not about exchanging a title for money. It was about exchanging 2 lives for freedom and $17 million. And the entry price into this business was high. She had to cross the taboo that keeps humanity within the bounds of civilization. She had to kill those who gave her life and shelter. But before we see the blood, let's look at the crime scene through the eyes of an architect. Let's enter this house and understand how its layout made the murder not just possible, but almost inevitable. The house on 2nd Street was not just a building, it was a trap. In criminology, there is a concept of silent witness. Usually it's an object, a bullet, a cigarette butt, or a fingerprint. But in the Borden case, the main silent witness, accomplice, and possibly the true culprit of the tragedy was the house itself. House number 92 on 2nd Street was not just a crime scene. It was a psychological pressure cooker designed to drive people mad. To understand how a double axe murder became possible on a quiet Thursday, we need to dismantle this house, board by board. We need to walk its floorboards, feel its smells, and bump our forehead against its locked doors. It was a monument to Andrew Borden's architectural sadism. From the outside, the house looked deceptively narrow, elongated into the yard, a typical Greek revival structure that by 1890 already seemed hopelessly outdated. It was painted in a gloomy beige-gray color that locals called road dust color. But the real nightmare began inside. The house layout was catastrophic for a family where mutual hatred reigned. Architects call this type of layout enfilade or railroad, but for the residents it meant one thing: no hallways. On the first floor, the kitchen led into the dining room into the sitting room. On the second floor, in the private area, the situation was even worse. To get to her bedroom in the back of the house, one had to pass through the parents' bedroom or the sisters'. Imagine the life of a 32-year-old woman, Lizzie, in this labyrinth. She had no way to enter or exit unnoticed. Every step of hers was monitored by the creaking of the floorboards. If she wanted to go down to the kitchen at night for a glass of water, she had to pass by her father's bed. This was life under a microscope. In this house, there was no concept of personal space. The walls were thin, the doors always under suspicion. Andrew Borden, obsessed with control, turned his home into a fortress. This is not a figure of speech. The house was barricaded like a bank during a siege. The front door had not 1, not 2, but 3 locking mechanisms: a spring latch, a heavy bolt, and the key. The back door was locked the same way. The first floor windows were tightly closed, shutters drawn even during the day. Andrew feared street burglars, not realizing that the greatest threat was already locked inside with him. Inside the family, a war of locks was underway. After the theft incident, when Lizzie stole the money and watches, Andrew locked the door connecting his bedroom to the daughter's bedroom. In response, Lizzie bought a heavy hook at the hardware store and screwed it to her door on her side. Then, she pushed a heavy wardrobe against the door. The interior door was barricaded from both sides. Father and daughter, living in adjacent rooms, barricaded themselves against each other like enemy armies. The only path for Lizzie now led through the back door and the kitchen. The house was physically divided into zones of influence. The front part belonged to the parents, the back to the daughters. They met only on the neutral strip, in the dining room, and even that less and less. Special attention deserves hygiene, or rather, its absence. This is a key moment for understanding the degree of humiliation of the women in this house. Andrew Borden had the means to install plumbing on all floors. It cost a pittance for his budget, but he refused. The house had only one faucet with cold water, in the kitchen sink. In 1892, the toilet in a millionaire's house was in the basement. A gloomy, damp basement with a dirt floor. To relieve oneself, one had to descend a steep staircase into the darkness. For Victorian women, wearing complex dresses with corsets and petticoats, this was not just inconvenient, it was humiliating. Therefore, slop pails, buckets for waste, stood in the bedrooms. Every morning, Lizzie and Emma had to carry out the contents of their chamber pots. Imagine this ritual. Heiresses of a vast fortune walking through the kitchen with buckets of excrement to pour them out in the backyard. This smell permeated their lives. This smell reminded them every morning, "You are nobody. You are just servants in your father's house." By the way, about the servant. Bridget Sullivan, a 26-year-old Irish woman, lived on the 3rd floor, in the attic. Her room was right under the roof. In August heat, when the temperature outside reached 35 degrees, the attic turned into an oven. There was no ventilation. In winter, frost lay on the walls. Bridget, whom the owners deprived even of her own name, calling her Maggie after the previous maid because they were too lazy to remember a new one, was the only person who saw everything. She was invisible in this house, a piece of living furniture. It is through her eyes that we often see the events of that morning. And it was precisely the house architecture, the presence of the back staircase leading to her cubbyhole, that played a fatal role. When Lizzie was killing her stepmother, Bridget was washing windows outside and then went up to rest. The layout of the stairs allowed the killer and the witness to miss each other by literally seconds. The house interior weighed on the psyche no less than the layout. It was a kingdom of dark walnut and heavy velvet. The furniture was massive, in the black walnut style popular 20 years earlier. On the walls, wallpaper with a dense floral pattern that made one's eyes swim. On the floors, carpets nailed down with tacks so they wouldn't slip. These carpets accumulated dust for decades. Andrew forbade opening the windows so that the wallpaper wouldn't fade and dirt wouldn't fly in. The air in the house was stale, heavy. It was the smell of old wood, kerosene, mothballs, medicines, and that very stewed lamb. Sensory deprivation. In this house, there were no bright colors, no music, no laughter. Only the ticking of clocks and creaking of floorboards. The guest room, where Abby was killed, was perhaps the most paradoxical in the house. It was the best room. It had the largest bed, a full-length mirror. That's where they put Uncle John Morse. And that's exactly where Abby Borden met her death. Why did she go there in the morning? To make the bed after the guest. Thrifty Andrew didn't see the need to keep a second maid for cleaning the upper floors. The millionaire's wife fluffed the mattresses herself. The room was a dead end. The killer entered, and Abby was trapped between the heavy bed and the dressing table. She had nowhere to run. The architecture left her no chance. The soundproofing in the house was strange. Due to the lack of hallways and abundance of carpets, sounds were muffled, not traveling far. This explains why Bridget, being outside or on the 3rd floor, might not hear the thud of Abby's heavy body falling. The house absorbed the sound of the blow, just as it had absorbed the joy of its inhabitants for years. But the most important detail of this architecture of power is the windows. The Borden house windows looked directly at the neighboring houses. The distance to Dr. Kelly's house on one side and Mrs. Churchill's on the other was just a few meters. Neighbors could see what was happening in the Borden windows if the curtains were open. This created an effect of reverse panopticon. Lizzie felt watched not only from inside, but also from outside. But on the day of the murder, this proximity played into Lizzie's hands. None of the neighbors saw anything. Why? Because the windows were dirty? Or because no one wanted to look at this gloomy, cursed house? This house was the physical embodiment of Andrew Borden's soul. Closed, dark, functional, and devoid of warmth. He built it to save money, but instead, he built the perfect set for a crime. The lack of hallways forced the killer to act boldly. The presence of the back staircase provided escape routes. The lack of plumbing forced the women to go down to the basement where, as it would later turn out, Lizzie could wash off bloodstains or hide the axe in the furnace ash. By the morning of August 4th, the house was ready. All doors were locked in the proper order. The maid was sent upstairs. The father had gone to the city. The stepmother entered the dead-end room. Lizzie Borden was left one-on-one with the architecture that she hated with all her soul. And she decided to destroy this prison in the most radical way. She couldn't rebuild the walls, but she could eliminate the jailers. If you look at the Borden house from the street in that fateful August, it seemed a bastion of respectability. Clean curtains, trimmed bushes, silence. But if we could remove the facade, like the lid from a can of preserves, we would smell the rot. And it's not just about moral decay, it's about physical, biological rot that permeated this house a few days before the tragedy. On Tuesday, August 2nd, the whole family took ill. Andrew, Abby, Lizzie, and even the maid, Maggie. They were vomiting, suffering from stomach cramps and dizziness. Abby, a simple soul, got scared. She ran to the neighbor, Dr. Bowen, and in panic declared, "We're being poisoned. Someone put poison in our milk." Dr. Bowen examined her, calmed her, and sent her home. He knew the diagnosis. It wasn't arsenic. It was Andrew Borden's greed. In the refrigerator, or rather, in the icebox, since electric refrigerators didn't exist yet, a leg of lamb had been sitting for several days. In 30-degree heat, meat spoils quickly. But Andrew forbade throwing away the product. The lamb was served hot, then cold, then as soup. The millionaire's family was poisoning themselves with cadaverous toxin from their own pot because the head of the family couldn't afford to lose a couple of dollars on a piece of meat. This poisoning episode is a perfect metaphor for their life. They were devouring themselves from the inside. But there was a disease in the house even worse than food poisoning. It was the disease of Lizzie Borden's soul. In the Victorian era, there was no concept of depression or bipolar disorder in the modern sense. Women were treated for hysteria and prescribed salts. But Lizzie suffered from something that psychiatrists today would call a deep neurosis on the background of suppressed aggression and possibly kleptomania. Yes, Lizzie Borden, the pious Sunday school teacher, was a thief. This was a secret that Fall River knew, but kept silent out of politeness. Lizzie went into the city's expensive stores, for example, Tilden Thurber in neighboring Providence. She took porcelain figurines, bolts of fabric, or trinkets and simply carried them out without paying. She didn't need these things. She needed the adrenaline. She needed the feeling that she was taking what she wanted in a world where nothing was given to her. The sellers knew about it. They didn't call the police, They simply sent the bill to Andrew Borden. And Andrew, that stingy tyrant, silently paid the bills for the stolen goods. He paid for silence. He understood that a trial over his thief daughter would destroy his banker's reputation faster than any financial crisis. This was their dark family secret. The father bought off his daughter from prison, but kept her in a domestic prison. Boredom ate at Lizzie like acid. Imagine a 32-year-old woman who has no job, no husband, no children, no right to vote. Her entire day consisted of changing clothes, eating, and embroidery. In this stifling idleness, thoughts began to rot. Lizzie sat for hours in her room, staring at the wall. The maid Maggie would later tell that Lizzie could freeze in the middle of the room with a blank stare, as if switching off from reality. In the medicine of that time, this was called twilight stupor. And so Wednesday arrives, August 3rd, the day before the end of the world. The atmosphere in the house is heated to the limit. Uncle John Morse arrives without luggage, a bad sign, meaning he is here for a quick deal. Lizzie avoids him. In the evening, she makes her famous visit to her friend Alice Russell, which we mentioned. But let's listen to her words more carefully. Lizzie tells Alice, "I'm afraid to fall asleep. I keep my eyes open half the time. I feel like something will happen." She tells a story about how she saw a strange man near the house. It's a lie. There was no man. Lizzie is constructing a reality in which the murder will become the logical outcome of an external threat. But in her voice sounds not the fear of a victim, but the excitement of a screenwriter before the premiere. When Lizzie returns home on Wednesday evening, she sees her parents in the sitting room. They are laughing. Uncle John and Andrew are discussing successful deals. Abby sits nearby. They look like a family. And Lizzie, passing by them upstairs on the narrow staircase, understands. She is superfluous in this equation. If the farm deal happens tomorrow, she will lose everything. The night of August 4th was stifling. Lizzie didn't sleep. The house was silent, interrupted only by the creaking of old boards. Perhaps it was in these hours that the puzzle finally came together in her head. The plan was simple and monstrous. She had a window of opportunity, 1.5 hours long. In the morning, the father would go to the bank. Uncle John would go to relatives. Only the fat, slow stepmother and the maid, whom it was easy to send away, would remain at home. Thursday morning began as usual. No ominous music, just everyday life. At 7 a.m., the family sat down to breakfast. On the table, the very same lamb leftovers, bananas, coffee, and Johnny cakes, Andrew and John Morse eat with appetite. Lizzie is not at the table. She comes down later, when the men have already finished. She drinks a cup of coffee. She doesn't touch the food. Her stomach is empty. This the autopsy will confirm. Adrenaline kills the appetite. At 8:45, Uncle John leaves. At 9:00, Andrew leaves. He goes not far, to the center, to check his properties. He promises to return for lunch. 3 women remain in the house. Abby Borden, 90 kilograms of good nature and submissiveness, goes upstairs to the guest room. She takes fresh pillowcases. She wants to tidy up after the guests' overnight stay. She is the ideal victim. She is slow, she stands with her back to the door, and she completely trusts the silence of her home. Bridget Maggie Sullivan receives an order from Abby to wash the windows. It's hellish work in such heat, but Maggie obediently goes for the bucket and rags. First, she washes the windows from inside, then goes outside. And here is the moment of truth. Lizzie Borden is left alone on the first floor. Maggie is in the yard. Father is in the city. Stepmother upstairs. Does Lizzie go to the basement? Or is the axe already hidden somewhere under her wide skirt? We don't know exactly. We know only that she goes up the stairs. She walks quietly, like a cat. She is wearing the Bengaline dress, but at this moment it seems not to rustle. She enters the guest room. Abby is on her knees, smoothing the sheet. She is vulnerable as never before. Lizzie takes a step. Abby doesn't hear. Second step. Lizzie raises her hand. At this moment, the rot that had been eating away at Lizzie's soul for years breaks out. Boredom, humiliations, envy, fear of poverty. All this concentrates in the axe blade. The first blow landed just above the ear. Abby fell face down on the carpet. She didn't even scream. And then Lizzie began to strike. She wasn't just killing. She was erasing the personality. She was destroying the hated image of Mrs. Borden. 19 blows. Blood splashed on the wallpaper, on the mirror, on the bed. But surprisingly, almost no traces remained on Lizzie herself. Perhaps she covered herself with her husband's apron? Or stood at such an angle? This is one of the mysteries we will never solve. The deed is done. The first part of the plan is completed. But now the scariest part begins. Time. Andrew will return only in 1.5 hours. What did Lizzie do during these 19 minutes? Imagine this horror. Upstairs in the room lies a mutilated corpse. Blood thickens in the heat. The smell becomes unbearable. And Lizzie, downstairs in the sitting room, calmly waits for her father. She perhaps adjusts her hair in front of the mirror. She perhaps reads a magazine. She lives in one house with her victim and waits for the second. This waiting time is the most eerie proof of her cold-bloodedness. This is not passion. Passion passes in minutes. Here we see calculation. She knew. If she left her father alive, he would guess. He would find the body. He would call the police. He would disinherit her. No. Andrew had to die. There could be no witnesses. At 10:45, the sound of a key is heard in the front door lock. The lock sticks. Andrew Borden swears, tugging the door. Inside, behind the door, stands Lizzie. She hears his breathing. She doesn't open. At that moment, the maid, Maggie, having finished washing the windows, runs up from inside and unlocks the lock. She sees the master. Lizzie at the top of the stairs, or in the dining room, lets out a giggle. A strange, nervous giggle. Andrew enters. He is tired. The heat has worn him out. He wants to lie down. He goes into the sitting room, takes off his jacket, puts on a cardigan, even in the heat he observes propriety, and lies down on the sofa. His head rests on the pillow. He closes his eyes. He thinks about his millions. He doesn't know that his millions are now standing over him with an axe. Andrew Borden closed his eyes for just a few minutes. It was a short nap of a 70-year-old millionaire, tired from the August heat and endless counting. He lay on the sofa in the sitting room, awkwardly drawing up his legs, as the furniture was bought not for comfort, but for status, and his tall stature didn't allow him to stretch out fully. He was wearing a heavy frock coat, which he didn't remove even at home. He was absolutely calm. He was in his fortress, behind 3 locks. The killer entered the room quietly. This time the blow was struck not from behind. Andrew was killed looking him straight in the face. It was an act of incredible intimacy and hatred. The very first blade strike cleaved the left eyeball in half. That very eye, which for decades had watched every penny, every egg from the farm, every cent of overdue rent, went dark instantly. After that, it was just the mechanics of rage. 11 blows. Andrew Borden's face, the face that instilled fear in Fall River's debtors, ceased to exist as a physical object. Blood sprayed in a fan onto the wall, onto the cheap lithograph, but surprisingly almost didn't get on the carpet. Andrew died the same way he lived, neatly, without taking extra space. The clock showed 11:10 a.m. Lizzie Borden stood in the midst of ringing silence. Now she was an orphan, and, much more importantly, the sole heiress. A few minutes later, the silence was broken by a voice. Not a scream of horror, but rather an insistent call. Lizzie called the maid, who was resting in her room on the 3rd floor. "Maggie, come down quick! Father's killed!" Someone came in and killed him. Maggie ran downstairs, tangling in her skirts. Lizzie stood by the back door, leaning on the jamb. She wasn't crying. She had no hysteria. Her hands weren't shaking. She looked confused, but dry-eyed. When the neighbor, Mrs. Adelaide Churchill, and the family doctor, Dr. Bowen, rushed into the house, they saw a gruesome scene in the sitting room. Andrew lay in a pool of blood that was still bright red, liquid, and warm. This meant one thing. Death had occurred just a few minutes ago. The killer must have been nearby. Or still here. "Where is Mrs. Borden?" someone present asked in horror. Lizzie, without batting an eye, replied, "I think she received a note and went to a sick person, but I thought I heard her return." Maggie and Mrs. Churchill, trembling with fear, went up the stairs to the 2nd floor. The door to the guest room was open. From the middle of the stairs, their eyes were at the level of the 2nd floor landing, and they saw what made their hearts stop. Abby Borden's body lay between the bed and the dressing table. The blood around her was dark, almost black, thick like syrup. It had already begun to clot. At that moment, Dr. Bowen, having examined both bodies, understood the terrible math of that morning. Abby had been dead for 1.5 hours. Andrew for just 10 minutes. All that time, 90 long minutes in the house, locked from the inside on all bolts. Only Lizzie had been present. The police flooded the house within half an hour. Marshal Hilliard, officers, local newspaper reporters. The news spread through Fall River faster than an electric charge. Borden and his wife hacked to death. A crowd began to gather at the fence. Hundreds of people, factory workers, shopkeepers, gawkers, pressed their faces to the fence bars. They looked at this gloomy, gray house like at the stage of a grand theater. Lizzie sat in the kitchen, fanning herself. When a policeman asked her about a tiny spot on her skirt, she calmly replied, "It's paint." She changed her statements with an ease that confused experienced detectives. Now she was in the barn, looking for lead for fishing, though she had no fishing rods. Now she was in the attic. Now she was eating pears in the garden. But the main event had already occurred. The family was physically destroyed. The empire that Andrew had built, brick by brick, now had no master. The point of no return had been passed. The axe, washed and rolled in furnace ash in the basement, was silent. But the mutilated bodies screamed that great greed breeds great monsters. The era of Andrew Borden ended with 11 blows of steel. The era of Lizzie began. On June 20th, 1893, what the newspapers called a triumph of justice, and cynics a triumph of capital, took place. The jury deliberated for only 1 hour. Verdict: not guilty. Lizzie Borden walked out of the courtroom a free woman. Andrew Borden's money, spent on a team of star lawyers, saved his murderer from the gallows. At that moment, Lizzie thought she had won. She and Emma entered into inheritance rights. They received about $350,000. In today's money, that's more than $10 million for the two of them. The dream came true. Lizzie immediately bought a mansion on French Street in that very elite The Hill district. 13 rooms, 4 bathrooms with hot water, electricity, luxurious fireplaces. She gave the house a name, Maplecroft, and ordered it carved on the granite step of the porch. She changed her name to Lisbeth, hoping that with the letters, the stigma of parricide would disappear. But Lizzie overlooked one thing. Money can buy a house, but it cannot buy neighbors. The upper society of Fall River, which she so aspired to, slammed its doors in her face forever. To them, she was a monster in silks. When Lizzie entered the church, parishioners demonstratively moved to other pews, leaving emptiness around her. No one came to her for tea. Children threw stones and rotten eggs at the windows of her new palace. Maplecroft became her new, more expensive prison. Lizzie lived there as an outcast, surrounded by luxury that she had no one to share with. She bought expensive cars, hired chauffeurs, went to Boston and New York where no one knew her, to feel like a normal person. The math of the curse worked flawlessly. In 1905, the last pillar collapsed. Emma, the faithful sister who had defended Lizzie all these years, packed her things and left. The reason was a party that Lizzie threw for the visiting actress Nance O'Neill. Emma couldn't bear her sister's scandalous connection with Bohemia. The two heiresses of bloody millions never spoke again. The Great Fall was quiet and slow. Lizzie Borden died in solitude in her huge house. Only servants and her beloved dogs were nearby. She died on June 1, 1927, of pneumonia. Emma died 9 days later in another city. Strange synchronicity. The dynasty ended instantly. There were no children. The inheritance for which the axe was raised crumbled to dust. Lizzie willed $30,000 to the Animal Rescue League. She loved dogs more than people. The rest went to distant relatives and friends. The Maplecroft house and the cursed house on 2nd Street were put up for sale. Personal belongings, dresses, jewelry, everything went under the hammer. The story of the Borden family turned into auction lots that people snapped up as gruesome souvenirs. Today, if you go to Oak Grove Cemetery in Fall River, you will find the Borden family plot. There stands a large monument, and around it, small headstones. Andrew, Abby, Emma, and a stone with the inscription, Lisbeth. Even after death, she tried to hide behind a made-up name, to separate herself from that Lizzie, whom the whole world judged. But history does not forgive attempts to rewrite the ending. Nothing remained of Andrew Borden's empire. No foundation, no library, no university named after him. $17 million in modern equivalent, accumulated from selling eggs and coffins with trimmed edges, dissolved into thin air. They went to lawyers, to payoffs to blackmailers, to maintaining empty mansions, and to animal shelters. The Borden family's financial ledger closed with a zero balance. The greed that was the engine of this family ultimately devoured itself. But there is one asset that turned out to be eternal. It is the house on 2nd Street itself. Today it is a thriving business. Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast. People pay hundreds of dollars for a night to lie on a replica of that very bed where Abby was found, or to sit on the sofa where Andrew was killed. They buy souvenir hatchets and t-shirts with fake bloodstains. There is a wicked irony in this that might have made Andrew Borden smile in his grave. His house, his fortress of stinginess, became the most profitable tourist attraction in the state. It continues to generate income even 130 years later. The father's greed and the daughter's cruelty created a brand that outlasted the textile industry, the Great Depression, and all the wars of the 20th century. Lizzie dreamed of entering history as a lady of high society. She wanted people to speak of her with respect at social soirees. But the only legacy she left is a children's rhyme. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 blows. These 4 lines proved stronger than any marble or gold. This is the price of wealth built on lovelessness. You can buy a mansion on the hill, you can buy the best defense in court, but you cannot buy a good memory.